My guest today is Dani Rodrik. Dani is a professor of international political economy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. His research revolves around globalization, political economy, and economic growth and development. His current work focuses on how to create more inclusive societies in developed and developing economies. He recently received the Princess of Asturias Award for Social Sciences. Thanks, Dani Rodrik, for being here. It's really very kind. Congratulations, first of all, on the Princesa de Asturias prize in Spain, which is a very, very prestigious prize in Spain. And when I am calling you Dani Rodrik, I have a slight kind of, I want something in me wants to call you Daniel Rodriguez. Your family comes somewhere from Spain, in fact, right? Hundreds of years ago.
That is right. Luis, it's very nice to be with you, and thanks for the kind words. Yes, I do have Sephardic roots. So many generations ago,
Yes.
my family was kicked out of Spain, and
Yes,
but it's a country I love to visit, and I was very honored by the prize.
Very good. I'm very pleased that you could make some time for us. I want to start talking about globalization, which is something that you have spent a lot of time lately thinking about, and you have argued that the pandemic exposed the limits of global cooperation to some extent, particularly in health. What went wrong? I mean, why? In what sense does the pandemic show that globalization is not working out as it should?
I think the pandemic highlights the possibilities of an alternative globalization, if you will. I think it just exposed us to an area of our global community, if I can call it that, where we have not done nearly enough in terms of institution building and global governance, and that's obviously the global public health arena. We have a World Health Organization that proved quite inadequate to the task. And I wonder if we had spent a little bit less time, opening up our borders to trade and investment and doing the bidding of multinational corporations and banks, instead invested our political capital, that is our governments, it invested our political capital in areas of global public goods where the consequences are much more important, as in the area of fighting health pandemics or, in fact, climate change, whether we might not have had a healthier globalization. So I think it's a bit of a question of a balance. I mean, you think about the role of the IMF, the WTO, and OECD. Those are all the institutions that we think about when we think about globalization. We don't think about WHO, UNESCO, UNICEF, or the ILO. And so I think it's a question of imbalance, I believe.
So basically, there are some areas where we have gone too far and some areas where we have not gone far enough. And you've touched on both of them. In your view, which are the areas where globalization could actually be, you've argued for a thinner globalization in some areas. In which areas should it be thinner and why?
Well, there are many elements of what I've called sort of hyper-globalization, which is really very much a kind of a corporate-led globalization, where we've pushed into domains where the overall gains from trade are limited, but the gains are very concentrated and the losses are also significant. So I would say many of the new areas in which the World Trade Organization has moved in terms of intellectual property rights, subsidies, agriculture, many areas of services, where I think we've gone a little bit too far beyond what sensible economics would justify. And I think those are all areas where there are very significant demonstrable gains for international corporations, whether it is pharmaceutical companies or high-tech firms. But where often the gains are not that large or sometimes negative for different parts of society. In finance, I would say the one area where we've pushed very hard with very few demonstrable gains and very significant costs in terms of crises and volatility is financial globalization. I think that's an area where, by making the free flow of short-term capital the norm rather than the exception, I think we've created more instability in the world economy, and the promise of increased saving, increased investment in low-income countries, or more consumption smoothing with a better allocation of capital back and forth. Those have not been realized, but we have gotten the financial crises that comes with more free-flowing capital.
So further than financial crisis, there's something that here in the European Union, the Parliament, we are very worried about, which is taxation. The fact that basically maintaining any level of tax fairness in the world right now with fiscal paradises, in a world with free capital movement, seems really, really hard to do. Every time we try to push, even within the European Union, it's really hard at the European Union level. It requires unanimity, so there's always going to be some small country that benefits hugely from these free capital flows and low taxes or no taxes, basically playing with corporate tax bases to make sure that at the end nobody pays anything. How do we solve this tax excessive tax globalization slash free capital movement problem, which I think is really massive right now in terms of causing problems of legitimacy and causing economic problems?
I think that's right. I think that's clearly an area where globalization has led to a kind of a downward arbitrage of tax rates, and that's very visible. And I think it's a good thing that people are now realizing that there's been some amount of international cooperation in terms of getting sort of BEPS and other sort of similar arrangements for more tax information sharing. And so now we're at a point where I think countries can begin to redress the balance of that the burden of taxation has moved too much on labor and has been reduced on capital because of capital's threat to leave to lower tax jurisdictions. But that's really a very good example of a fundamental trade-off that we face whenever we're thinking of globalization, which is that there's always a trade-off between the gains from trade that we get by lowering barriers and the loss in regulatory diversity that must follow as a result. That is to say that if you make capital mobility too free and too easy, it's going to be very difficult for jurisdictions, for countries that want to tax capital at a higher rate, to maintain those higher tax rates. So I think the balance has gone too far in the direction of trying to reap those gains from trade, and we have not valued the benefits of regulatory diversity, the idea that different countries may want to have different regulations or standards. So this is very clear in the area of taxation, but it's really a universal problem. It's also the case, for example, it's an issue you told me you were just thinking about, of carbon border taxes, which is the whole point again, is that if some countries want to have serious decarbonization policies and therefore want to impose carbon taxes, how will their domestic firms compete against imports from jurisdictions where there aren't such decarbonization policies? And therefore, it's entirely appropriate, now we are coming to appreciate, to have carbon border taxes to ensure that imports are essentially don't undermine domestic decarbonization policies. You might say the same about sort of how our domestic labor standards or social standards are affected when we trade with countries with very weak labor standards, or where collective bargaining is not recognized and labor rights are repressed. Essentially, we are telling our own workers that, look, you have to compete on the same terms as the workers in the rest of the world that don't have the kinds of bargaining rights and social rights that you have. And for the longest time, still to this day, we think that's perfectly normal, whereas I would argue that the logic is exactly analogous to the logic of having carbon taxes at the border, or essentially throwing some sand at the wheels of international finance so that countries can maintain different regulatory tax regimes. That there's also, we need to think about what one might call sort of anti-social dumping, if you will. if you want to maintain your labor standards, your social rights, that there will be times when you may want to restrict trade. So again, it just goes back to recognizing this fundamental trade-off that, like economists, we know, you cannot have everything at once. You cannot maximize the gains from trade, because that means you're giving up too much of the benefits of regulatory diversity, that different nations want different types of public goods.
So,
You want a kind of intermediate point.
So you're talking about different examples, and you're mentioning several criteria that should give us some common standard that we can apply. How do we know which are areas where we can go further, where we need global governance, which are areas where we don't need global governance and we need more individual rules? What are the key criteria that we should use to tell apart one from the other?
I think there are two sets of circumstances when the argument for global governance is very strong. One is when we're talking about a true global public good or a true global public bad that we want to avoid. So that's why I think the public health, pandemics, fighting pandemics, information sharing sessions, public health systems, because that's a true global public good, and I think that's where we need strong global governance regimes. The second huge big area of global public good, of course, is fighting climate change. So those are areas where there's a very strong argument. And what is critical about global public goods is that essentially that this is only can be provided through collaboration, because the interest of each individual nation is to free ride on the investments of other countries. So you want every other country to decarbonize, but you want to not impose any cost on your own industries. Now, the world economy is not a global public good in the sense that the benefits of pursuing open trade policies, of having good financial regulations, of having appropriate macroeconomic stability, the benefits are primarily domestic. So I think, unlike what many people believe, that there's a kind of analogy between the global commons in the area of climate change and the global commons in the area of economics. That's a very inappropriate analogy. And therefore, in many areas of economics, I think the global public good argument does not apply. And then we're better off leaving much greater leeway for countries to do what they want. There's one exception to this, and I'll just mention it. There's a sort of beggar thy neighbor policies, where the whole point of the policy is you derive some national benefits at the expense of other countries, like exercising monopoly power or harmful tax competition, when there's no way you're getting the investment. You just paper corporations that are drawn in and you're undercutting. So there are some economic areas where there's good arguments for global regulation as well. But most of the things that we negotiate in international trade agreements or international finance don't have that nature.
So let me throw one important spanner in the whole thinking about global governance. If we don't have a global hegemon, if we don't have somebody who actually can enforce without any enforcement mechanism, once the US becomes one more purely self-interested actor who doesn't really care about the world order, I mean, trade, all the ideas about the World Health Organization, the export restrictions on medical equipment, the constraints on sharing data, the rules on taxes, it's very difficult to enforce something that causes win-lose trade-offs, that somebody wins, somebody's going to lose even a little bit, without any police, without any enforcement. Can we really have any kind of globalization in the future without somebody who can make sure that people behave by the rules and not like the US did in the 3M imports of medical equipment, behave actually almost as a rogue actor?
No, as I was suggesting, I think in many economic areas, this is not an issue because, it's in a nation's own interest to pursue policies that are by and large to the benefit of everybody else. So if you are an economy, if you can manage your domestic social problems and your domestic distributional problems, then you do want to maintain a fairly openness to the rest of the world. So you do it because it's on your own interest, right? We teach comparative advantage and the gains from trade. I mean, the reason that you want to, maintain open borders to goods and services is not that you want to confer benefits to your other countries. It's because you want to reap those gains from trade. Now, where you run into a problem is when you try to sign these, endless trade agreements, which and you don't do what's required to take care of the domestic economy, and then that becomes an unsustainable bargain because ultimately you get this backlash that people realize, that what are we doing in this world economy? I mean, they've been telling us that the globalization would lift all. It was a tide that would lift all boats, but we see a lot of people getting very wealthy and rich out of globalization, whereas we're sort of being really squeezed here. And the middle class has been squeezed in a lot of countries because of the consequences of globalization. So I think there are areas where, and you're absolutely right, that the only way you can maintain cooperation in those areas where it's really critical is through sort of slowly building trust and reputation and sort of saying that, you want to do this because in the long run, it's to everybody's interest. But I think it's a false dilemma for many economic areas, because I think the lesson of the Bretton Woods era, for example, where the international disciplines were very, very weak, right? GATT was not worth the paper it was written on in terms of its enforcement power. Yet we got huge amounts of trade liberalization. Why? Because countries were doing the right thing domestically. They were growing with inclusion and equity. And when countries are doing well, they're much more likely to condone opening up to the rest of the world. So the best thing we can actually do for the world economy and for globalization is actually allowing countries to solve their domestic problems. And that's, I think, where we are.
But in some of those other areas you mentioned, cooperation is important. Climate, health, tax havens, health pandemics in particular. It does seem like at a particular time, cooperation is always going to break down because there's always going to be somebody who's interested and who's powerful and who can, at least in their own interest, not follow those rules. So there is where, I fear that, yes, we all kind of see those gains. Even the European Union, where we have strong institutions, we can't really ensure that certain countries don't free ride without some sort of coercive power of some kind.
No, that is the dilemma of international relations. As you said, there is no enforcer, and so you need to rely on, self-enforcing agreements, and that's it requires sort of building trust and investing in reputation and it helps to have larger nations sort of demonstrate that they're willing to do what it takes. And I think, and when you don't have the largest countries in the world doing that, and certainly the Trump administration has been a terrible example of this,
yeah.
Or where you're in a kind of a transitional point in history where one power is in decline, another one is rising, such as in the context of U.S.-China relations. So it becomes much harder to maintain that that cooperation. But I want to come back and really say that I think the biggest problem we face is not lack of global cooperation or the absence of global governance. The biggest problem we have now is lousy domestic governance. And I'm willing to bet anything that where we will see the action that really matters, even we've seen it in with respect to the COVID-19, but I think even in climate change, I think eventually it's going to be domestic action that's going to fix things. Even though the economic logic is why should the EU have decarbonization policies? Why should California declare itself sort of a carbon-free zone for cars? I mean it makes no sense. But I think it's basically you have political action and political community at the level of much smaller jurisdictions, and that's where you're going to get the action. And so our challenge is to really fix local and national governance.
So let's turn to that. Let's turn to that. You were hinting at this already before. The big change in domestic policies throughout the world, politics throughout the world, both in the US and Europe and everywhere else, has been the rise of populism. And you've been also thinking about quite a bit why has this happened, what are the factors, how do we counter it, etc. And you have basically proposed a framework where essentially, I mean, there are supply and demand, as we economists like to put it, factors that could have contributed, and you try to tease apart those factors. Why don't we start maybe with the demand side for populist politics, and what are the main factors on the demand side that you think are causing this growth in this new phenomenon?
I think there have been a number of economic shocks or secular trends. Globalization is one of them, but it's not the only one. We have rapid technological change linked to both. Advanced countries have been experiencing, deindustrialization, so the disappearance of factory jobs and sort of middle-class jobs in a lot of countries. We have the deregulation of labor markets and the associated rise in labor market insecurities, the creation of sort of insider versus outsider labor markets, with a lot of workers being left without the protection of insider status. So I think in general, we've had a kind of a shrinking of the middle class and a rise in economic insecurity that is actually relatively common, much more common than the rise in inequality per se, because we know not every country in Europe, for example, has had an increase in inequality, but the shrinkage of the middle class and the rise in economic insecurity, I think, is fairly common. So what I think that makes is it makes people uneasy, insecure, and they, sort of on the one hand, it makes people want to get some kind of protection. So arguments that we want to protect you from the immigrants, or we want to protect you from Chinese imports, becomes more salient and acceptable. And it also, I think, leads a certain kind of cultural, identity-based insider-outsides. Communities that are losing economic insecurity are also communities that are going to be much more sort of turning against the others that don't look like them, don't think like them, that have a different skin color, different religion. So it also promotes sort of cultural or identity-based cleavages. So I think, and so it increases the demand for the kinds of things that right-wing populists in particular have been selling, which is this right-wing, nativist, xenophobic kind of populism. So that would be the story on the demand side.
So if you think about places like Hungary and Poland, you were just hinting at them, at the rise of populism in Europe. These are places that don't really have a lot of immigration, and those seem to have a lot of insecurity, in the sense that over the last 30 years, they've been extremely successful post-communism. These have been countries that have grown a lot. How do they fit? Why do people have demand side? Have demand for these type of ideologies, in your view, in places like that?
So when it comes to countries like the Hungary or Poland or Russia, Turkey, Brazil, so as we move into sort of list of countries that were never long-term democracies, I am of two minds. I think to some extent the kind of argument that I was giving you has played a bit of a role in that, for example, in Hungary or in Poland, as these countries have done well overall. But if you look at how, for example, relatively uneducated or less educated males feel about their status in society, particularly those who are not living in major metropolitan centers, but in the countryside or smaller towns, they feel that they have been left behind. And so that's the kind of, so they're receptive to regimes that are willing to capitalize on their sense of loss of control, loss of social status, and I think that's partly driven by the same kind of economic trends that I was talking about before. Absolutely, have done very well, but not everybody in those countries has done equally well. But there is something else, and I think that's why I'm of two minds when we talk about not Western Europe or the United States with very long histories of liberal democracy, but countries with very short histories of democracy, which is, I'm not so sure that what we're seeing in countries like Hungary or Russia or Brazil or Philippines or Turkey is not just another instance of a perennial backsliding towards authoritarianism. That countries without a long experience and history of liberal democracy have always been subject to. It looks superficially similar to the populism of the West or to Trump's populism, but I think that's only because they're borrowing the same kind of technology of appealing to masses, where democracy has become a global norm. So ruling simply by sort of the brute force of the military or police power has become less acceptable. We have new technology, social media, so it becomes much easier to construct narratives about us versus others, about how the rest of the world is taking advantage of us. So I think the technology of how the new authoritarians rule is very similar to the technology of the populists in the West. But I sometimes wonder if it is more a case of simple, just straightforward case of reversion to authoritarianism,
Okay.
which has always been a feature of countries.
So let's move to the other side of the explanation, which has to do with the supply side effect. The politicians, the political candidates who actually use these, try to target certain of these insecurities. What are the effects here, and what the role do they play? Some of my colleagues, maybe walking behind now, are in those categories of exploring those insecurities.
So the demand story was, people experiencing greater economic insecurity and therefore demanding more redistributive or more identity-based policies. The supply side story is that it is the reaction of parties of the right to the fact that the kinds of policies that centrist parties have pursued in the last 3 or 4 decades has essentially created, has made their economic policies less popular. So in terms of economics speak, it's the median voter on economic issues has moved away from the kinds of economic policies that parties of the right want, which is lower taxes, more deregulation, lower transfers. So on all of these issues, these policies become less popular as the middle classes and lower middle classes feel more insecure. So those parties have responded by selling something else. Rather than selling economic policies, which are very unpopular, they respond by selling essentially xenophobia, nativism, by demonizing the other, whatever the other is in their specific societies. And in the US, of course, that would be African Americans. In European Union, it will be immigrants, North Africans and Turks and others. So it's a kind of trying to appeal to their base on a kind of an identity and cultural basis rather than and so I think that we can see this very much in terms of how parties of the right have moved. This is very clear with respect to the Republican Party in the United States, and it predates Trump. It really goes back to the 1980s, even to some extent to Nixon. And so it's there, and it sort of has accompanied this process of these economic dislocations. And the big surprise in all of this is, where have the parties of the left been? Yeah. Why have they not provided the kinds of policies that are needed? And that's another question.
So yeah, I was exactly heading there, right? So if there's economic insecurity, there's inequality. You would think that somebody saying, look, I'm going to cure this insecurity by giving everybody certain entitlements, etc., would be very popular. And in fact, left-wing populists have really only succeeded, I don't know, to some extent in Greece, to some extent in Spain, very, very punctually. We have seen much more right-wing populism. Why is that?
It's partly a puzzle, but I think part of the explanation is that the parties of the left, center left, were essentially, were experienced what I might call a kind of a cognitive capture by the educated elite, who had bought in so much into this sort of narrative of economic liberalization, deregulation, globalization. And we have to remember that it was the center left that really pushed hyper-globalization. It was Clinton, it was the Blair labor rights, it was Schroeder in Germany. In France, it was, of course, the socialists that pushed for financial market and capital market integration in the context of the European Union. So I think they were part of not only were they part of this agenda, they were actually very much the pushers of this agenda. And I think so they had difficulty in making the adjustment. I would say that it's probably a temporary difficulty because we're already seeing, for example, in the United States, that even though Joe Biden himself is a centrist, the Democratic Party platform today is on every issue way to the left of what Hillary Clinton was proposing 4 years ago. So even though Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were not successful in winning the nomination, their ideas to a fundamental extent have actually moved the party to the left. So we do see, I think, a response on the left that is taking place. But I think you're right. I mean, the right-wing populists were much more successful early on.
They could exploit those insecurities and sell identity, which, I mean, in some sense, identity is not a cure to the problems that the people are actually suffering, right? This is the interesting thing, particularly very noticeable in the US, where it seems to us, to many people, at least from the outside, that people vote directly against their own self-interest. That's this really extraordinary puzzle in political marketing. I don't know what's the way to call it, but it seems like a huge success of political marketing.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that people vote against their self-interest, because I think self-interest goes beyond economics. I mean, I think your sense of who you are, your identity, what kind of a society you want to live in is also part of your self-interest. But they're certainly voting against their economic self-interest. But I think so. What has happened, and that's why I think the supply side story is so important. So I think what the Republican Party has successfully done is by making those sort of the identity parts of self-interest much more salient by essentially priming those kinds of issues. And it's very interesting. I mean, the strategy was very explicit that without actually mentioning African Americans, that certain policies would be tagged or discussed in such ways that it would be clear that in the receiver's ear, it would be a very kind of racial connotations would be clear. So when you talk about the reform of the welfare transfers, for example, it's really about you talk about undeserving mothers, or when you talk about who's benefiting from this, you don't have to mention Black Americans. Certain people will hear this as, yeah, maybe this is not in our economic interest, but other people will get hurt more. And so in some sense, it's not that I don't think Americans have become more racist. I mean, I think racism has always been an undercurrent of American politics, in the same way that xenophobia in Europe has always existed. But I think they're triggered and they're primed by the kind of public narrative of parties and the kinds of discussion that we have. And I think that's why it seems like it's become a bigger driver. Whereas I would think ultimately it's really just the economic malfunction that is really driving a lot of this.
So talking about now trying to think, these are kind of, at least in my mind, the wrong solutions, populism, etc. Trying to think about the right solutions, and what kind of people from center, progressive, liberal-minded, who have been always on the defense of this consensus, and now are kind of wondering what are we doing wrong. One of the key responses that we traditionally give to people losing jobs, inequality, globalization, etc., is training, skills, upgrading, etc. You're not very convinced that investment in skills and training is a good way to respond to these loss of middle class jobs. And you don't really think that this is something that is going to really work as well as some of us would expect. What's your fear here?
Two things. One is that if we leave technology and the investment and employment decisions of firms to their own devices, then I think just emphasizing skills and training and sort of education is a losing battle because we will never catch up. So it's always trying to invest more education. That's sort of the generic solution every time. And nothing against education and investment in skills, but the point of a well-functioning economy is to create jobs for the people it does have, not the people that it hopes that it's going to train in the future. So that is kind of just emphasizing the skills part is on its own is just a losing battle because you will never catch up. The second thing is that it's fine to invest in people's education, but if firms, employers are not increasing their demand for people, for workers, it's not going to do much for you to invest in skills if the jobs aren't there. So I think there are sort of with globalization and technological change, there are sort of secular trends going on that sort of inherently polarizing the labor market and leading to the disappearance of jobs in the middle of the skill distribution, the kinds of jobs that are the backbone of a middle class. And if those jobs aren't being produced, it's no good to keep on investing in skills. The jobs simply won't be there. So we need, complementary strategies that will ensure that there is an increase in the supply of jobs in that middle of the skill distribution, and that means going beyond simply education and training.
So what are for you the elements of we had the Washington consensus that you demolish in your work. What is the new Washington or the new Boston consensus, if you want? What are the elements of a new progressive liberal kind of view of the world that actually works for the people, preserves freedoms, preserves all the things that we have attained, but actually works for everybody and stops this populism? How would you guide that policy making?
Well, first, I mean, I hope we never get another consensus in policy, because I think we need a lot of experimentation, and diversity in policy is not a consensus. But I do think that there is a common and universal problem that these experimental policies have to target. And that's what I was referring to when it's related to what I was talking about before, which is that I think the common target has to be, creating good jobs. I think, that the way to solve this problem our societies face is not going to be by simply redistributing income, tax and transfer. That's not going to work. Many societies have reached the limit, and I think people want to live satisfying lives with meaningful jobs, and so that's producing good jobs for the middle class, I think, and the lower middle class is the key target. What is that going to require? I think that's going to require a whole range of policies that go beyond what we have focused on to date. It means, for example, making those training programs and educational programs much more connected to the employer. So we find that, for example, the training programs that work best are those where the trainers and the organizations that provide those services, like in Europe, the public employment services that provide advanced labor market, the active labor market policies, need to be much more connected to the employers. And the idea is both to ensure that employers' needs are met, but also that employers in time start to take into account in their human resources and their employment practices the needs of the local community. We need a kind of new types of industrial policies that are much less targeted on subsidizing capital investment, but much more directly in terms of providing a portfolio of services to small and medium-sized enterprises, with a quid pro quo being that in return for those productivity-enhancing services, that they will in fact be generating employment at the same time. I think that, an area that I think is very, very challenging. I think we need to rethink our innovation and technology policies, where we essentially completely leave aside questions about the direction of technological change when it comes to the creation of good jobs. We understand that that we can redirect innovation where green technologies are concerned, but there is a completely analogous externality when it comes to the failure to create good jobs, because that has tremendously negative effects on local communities. So we also need to think about how to redirect AI, automation, new technologies in ways where, to the extent possible, we're subsidizing or encouraging technologies that complement labor as opposed to replace them. And that, I think, is a fundamental reorientation of our innovation policies. I think in the European context, for example, I think the European Green Deal is an opportunity to think about sort of what type of green investments are much more likely to be friendly to labor, and what type are less likely. So I think that's, for example, an angle that's, as far as I can see, is not explicitly in the design of the European Green Deal.
That's a good point. Well, thanks very much. I think we've run out of time. I would love to spend some time on how artificial intelligence can complement rather than substitute labor, but that's for another time. Thank you very much. It was really a pleasure to chat to you. I appreciate all your time.
Thank you, Luis. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.